motivation researchers, and welcome to another one of our Motivation Monday videos. As a reminder for those of you who are tuning in for the first time, my name is Marissa Green, and I am currently a third-year doctoral student in educational psychology at The Ohio State University, and I'm here today with Dennis McInerney, honorary professor at the Education University of Hong Kong and the Australian Catholic University. In today's video, I'll be speaking with Dennis about his thoughts about the importance of culture for students' motivation. So Dennis, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks, Marissa. It's a pleasure.
All right. So the first question I have for you, Dennis, is how do sociocultural factors influence student motivation and engagement?
Sociocultural is a very, very broad term and really a very easy term to understand, although in education research is not very well understood or used. Sociocultural means social factors and cultural factors that impact on a child's learning and engagement with school. So social factors are easy. The gender, family, background, parental education, peers, SES, urban and rural location, the valuing of the utility of education and so on. There's a whole lot of social factors that are important. Now, interlocking with those social factors are cultural factors, which are separate, but of course linked to things like whether the society is individualistic or collectivist, whether it's a high or low status society, whether it's Confucianism based, the type of education that's been there historically, and the language and language conventions that are used. Now, all of these factors must be considered. We must consider where the child is physically and psychologically. What space does he inhabit in order to facilitate his learning and engage him in learning effectively? In fact, sociocultural, these influences have been part of theories of education for many, many years, a long time, and they underpin theories like Vygotsky and Bronfenbrenner. The thing about educational research, and in particular motivation research, is that we don't consider the full range of sociocultural variables that might be impacting a child's engagement in learning. But I'm going to give a couple of points here that's drawn from one of the textbooks I wrote that draw it out a little bit more clearly what teachers could do or should do to maximise motivation by paying attention to cultural factors. One, very simply, appreciate the cultural knowledge that the child brings to the school. Hold high expectations of all students from any cultural group, any minority groups, and focus on academic achievement for all. Embed learning within culturally valued knowledge and experiences. So if you're talking about history, involve the history of the group. If you're talking about music, teaching about music, use the musicology of the cultural group and use that as a bridge to new learning. Situate learning within culturally appropriate social situations, such as teacher-student interviews or interactions, so that they're consistent with cultural values and practices. Establish an environment built on genuine respect, where differences and similarities are respected and valued. Foster a classroom climate that is responsive to differing student characteristics. For example, their ways of knowing, their ways of understanding, their ways of representing and expressing typically their ideas, which are employed in a particular culture. And finally, include culturally appropriate curriculum content and instructional processes. They're not my principles. Their principles have been drawn from a lot of sources, including Hollins, for example, and Reel, and people like that. Plenty of sources available on this. And again, though, these sorts of sources and information, which is very valuable for teachers, aren't taken up that often in educational psychological research in the motivational area. And this is one of my bugbears. Why isn't it happening more often? It's so obvious that it should. So looking forward, what should researchers in the motivation special interest group and more broadly do? Well, they need to consider, of course, the cultural dimensions of the theoretical frameworks they use. All the research we do, if it's to be published, requires a theoretical framework. The reviewers ask for that all the time. It's a weak theoretical framework, or what is the theoretical framework, and so on. Now, every theory has an implicit and often explicit value position that may or may not be relevant or salient in diverse cultural settings. So even a most basic theory, for example, attribution theory, which has ability, effort, task difficulty, and luck, and its valences, which are locus of control, stability, and controllability, are all potentially culturally loaded. It's often said attribution theory is a culture-free sort of theory because the dynamics will work in any culture, any setting. I even heard Professor Weiner talk about that at the recent AERA conference, you might recall. But I don't agree with that. Every one of those, ability, effort, task, difficulty, and luck, needs to be and should be looked through cultural lenses. We need to use cultural lenses for it. Take another one, self-determination theory. It has to be interrogated for its cultural meaning in terms of relatedness. What does that mean in different cultures? Autonomy. What does that mean, culture to culture? And competence. What does that mean? And introjected motivation. Now, this is not a criticism. It's simply saying that they're two good examples of theoretical frameworks that can be re-examined and should be re-examined through a sociocultural lens. Now, all theories need to be subjected to close scrutiny before applying them in diverse settings. Now, what we should be doing is doing more bottom-up ethics studies so that we, one, can really ascertain whether our theoretical framework is there in the first place without superimposing it on top. Let's have a look at the people, the students, and so on, when they talk about it, when they demonstrate behaviour, actually can be labelled in the sorts of labels that we use in goal theory or attribution theory or self-determination theory. And more importantly, or at least as importantly, are there crucial missing values, missing determinants of their behaviour that aren't encompassed in any of those theories already? So this is the importance of the emic and the etic values being brought together in particular studies. Finally, all research should carefully consider, this is an important preaching sort of thing too. We often do research which looks at the effect of X on Y, and sometimes we put mediators in and so on to examine what the paths are. But very often we neglect the moderating variables that might have an impact in either enhancing or deadening the effects of particular variables from A to B. And these are the sociocultural factors. Very few of the range of sociocultural factors that I rattled off at the beginning of my talk here are actually ever included. As a mere handful of them are. So I just argue and put forward to the students listening to this podcast that these are all important. When you're designing your studies in the first place, think about the sociocultural ramifications of it, query everything first before you start, and then you'll be making an original and important contribution to research in motivation.
Thank you so much for your time, Dennis.
Thanks, Marissa. Nice talking to you.